The saloon went silent when she walked in. Mary Beth Carrington's boots thudded against the polished wooden floor, each step sending up tiny clouds of dust that caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that defied the whispered insults of the townsfolk. Yet the sting of mockery was never far behind. They called her Big Body, pointing fingers and smirking as if her broad shoulders and generous curves were some sort of crime. Even the children, with their curious eyes and cruel giggles, had learned to mimic the grown-ups' ridicule. Mary. Beth's heart beat fast, not from fear, but from the determination to endure, to survive in a town that seemed determined to make her invisible. She wore a simple brown dress, stitched by her own hands, and a faded blue bonnet that shadowed her freckled face. The air inside the saloon smelled of stale whiskey, sweat, and cigar smoke, an aroma that had become strangely comforting over the years, masking the bitterness of her life. As she walked past the poker tables and the rowdy men who leered from behind their glasses, she kept her chin high. She was used to the whispers, the snickers, and the pointed fingers. But today, she told herself, today she would not flee. Her eyes scanned the room. The bartender, a grizzled man with a patch over one eye, raised an eyebrow at her but said nothing. A piano played a jaunty, discordant tune in the corner, but Mary Beth barely noticed it. Her focus was on the young widow sitting alone at a table near the back. Mary Beth had come to collect some supplies owed to her from sewing work done for the woman. She moved carefully through the crowd, the heavy skirts of her dress brushing against the legs of the tables, feeling the weight of every stare. "You sure you should be out here?" A young man snickered from the bar stool, his words coated with mockery. "Don't break the floor with that big body of yours." Laughter rippled around him, cruel and hollow. Mary Beth froze for a fraction of a second, tasting the familiar bitterness of shame. Then she clenched her fists at her sides, inhaled the scent of whiskey and pine from the mountains beyond, and kept walking. She refused to let their laughter pierce her any further. As she reached the widow's table, a shadow fell across the room. The chatter dimmed, eyes turning toward the doorway. Mary Beth followed their gaze and stopped mid-step, standing tall. In the doorway was a man unlike any she had ever seen in this dusty, sun-baked town. Shirtless, with a muscular frame that seemed carved from stone, he had long black hair cascading over broad shoulders and adorned with glinting beads and tribal jewelry that clinked softly with each step. His presence was magnetic, commanding the attention of everyone in the room without a word. The smell of leather, earth, and smoke seemed to accompany him, mingling with the saloon's stale whiskey. The man's dark eyes swept across the room and settled on Mary Beth. For a moment, she felt exposed, as if he could see the years of hurt, the loneliness, and the quiet pride that had carried her this far. There was no mockery in his gaze, no judgment, only a calm, almost reverent acknowledgement. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen. A warmth spread through her chest, mingling with the tension that had tightened her shoulders. For so long, the townspeople, sensing something different in the air, shifted uneasily. Whispers spread. Who is he? Why is he looking at her like that? Mary Beth, for her part, felt a spark of hope she hadn't dared to feel in decades. Perhaps this stranger, this warrior man who carried the wilderness in his eyes, could see beyond the shallow judgments of this town. Perhaps he could see the woman she had always been, the woman who deserved respect, love, and a place in the world beyond ridicule. Her lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. The whispers and laughter faded into the background. For the first time in years, Mary Beth felt that maybe, just maybe, her story was about to change. The morning sun baked the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Mary Beth Carrington made her way through the market square, baskets of fresh bread, eggs, and vegetables swinging from her arms. The smell of horse sweat, fresh hay, and warm bread mingled. In the air, a sensory assault she had grown used to over the years. Yet today, the familiar scents carried an added sting, the cruel laughter and whispers of townsfolk following her like shadows. Look at her. Big Buddy's hauling the hole. Mark it. A man sneered from behind a stack of barrels, his voice cracking with false mirth. Children giggled, pointing fingers as if it were a game. Women clutched their aprons, whispering, "She thinks she's good enough to walk among us." Mary Beth's cheeks flushed, but she squared her shoulders, ignoring the chorus of ridicule. She had learned long ago that fleeing only strengthened their sense of power. She passed a wooden stall where apples were stacked like little pyramids, the red and gold shining under the sun. A woman behind the stall shook her head in sympathy. "Don't mind them," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the laughter. Mary Beth offered a small, polite nod, appreciating the kindness but not allowing it to break her focus. Her mind was set on completing her errands quickly and retreating before the humiliation became unbearable. Suddenly, the murmurs shifted to a collective gasp. Heads turned, boots shuffled, and a hush fell over the market square. Mary Beth froze mid-step, sensing something she could not yet see. From the corner of her eye, she glimpsed him. The warrior from the Saloon d'Ate Anita stood at the far end of the square, tall and imposing. His long black hair rippled over broad shoulders glistening with muscle, adorned with leather straps and tribal jewelry that shimmered in the sunlight. Even shirtless and barefooted on the hot dirt, he carried an air of authority and calm that made the laughter around him falter. Children and adults alike stopped in their tracks, some whispering, others staring in wide-eyed disbelief. The heat of the sun seemed to dim in his presence, as if the earth itself acknowledged the strength and dignity he radiated. Mary Beth's heart skipped a beat. The nerves that had tightened her chest for decades loosened slightly. The same dark, unwavering eyes that had held her gaze in the saloon now searched the crowd, and when they found her, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. For the first time, someone outside herself seemed to see beyond the mockery, beyond the so-called shame that had defined her life. A young boy, emboldened by the laughter of his friends, shouted, "Hey, Big Body!" Look at him staring at you. You think he cares? The townsfolk snickered, waiting for Mary Beth to shrink under the words. But she did not. She inhaled the scent of sun-baked dirt, horse sweat, and sagebrush drifting from the nearby hills. Her chin lifted. Her fingers gripped the baskets tighter, not out of fear, but determination. Tayanita began walking toward her, each step deliberate, the beaded jewelry on his arms and chest catching the sunlight. Dust swirled around his boots, adding to the cinematic weight of his presence. The murmurs of the crowd grew uncertain, shifting into whispers as their curiosity turned to awe. Mary Beth felt herself drawn toward him, the years of ridicule momentarily silenced by the gravity of his gaze. When he reached her, he stopped a few feet away, not too close to intimidate, yet near enough that she could feel the energy radiating from him. "Are you Mary Beth Carrington?" he asked, his deep, steady voice cutting through the lingering whispers. She nodded, unsure if she should be terrified or exhilarated. "I have watched how they treat you," he continued, eyes scanning the square briefly before returning to hers. "It is not your body they mock, it is their own fear that they cannot understand your strength." His words hit her like a warm wind across the sun-scorched plains. For the first time, Mary Beth felt a measure of validation, a glimpse of what life could be when someone truly saw her. The townsfolk, sensing the unspoken bond forming between the two, muttered among themselves, some shifting uncomfortably on their feet. The air was thick with tension, the smell of dust, sweat, and anticipation hanging in every corner. Mary Beth, heart pounding, realized that life in Willow Creek was no longer going to be defined solely by humiliation. For the first time, there was a chance for something else, a chance for respect, for acknowledgement, perhaps even for love. She took a cautious step closer to Tayanita, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that conveyed acceptance, strength, and a quiet promise. The market square had returned to a cautious murmur, the townsfolk unsure whether to continue their daily routines or watch the unfolding scene. Mary Beth Carrington stood frozen for a moment, baskets heavy in her arms, as Tayanita approached. His bare feet stirred dust from the dirt road, and the beads on his chest and arms glinted in the sunlight, moving softly with each step. There was a rhythm to his walk, steady and unyielding, like the pulse of the land itself. When he reached her, he stopped, not too close to intimidate, but near enough to make her heart pound. "Mary Beth Carrington," he said, his deep voice steady, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to respect and authority. She nodded, unsure if words could express the mixture of fear and hope that fluttered in her chest. "I have watched how they treat you," Tayanita continued, his dark eyes sweeping the crowd before returning to her. "It is not your body they mock, it is their own fear that they cannot comprehend your strength." His words washed over her like a warm wind across the plains, carrying with them a validation she had longed for decades. Mary Beth felt the tightness in her chest loosen, as though a weight she had carried for years was beginning to lift. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring in awe. A few tried to smirk, but the confidence in Tayanita's stance silenced their bravado. Dust swirled around his boots, catching in the sunlight, giving him an almost otherworldly presence. He did not seem like one to be swayed by ridicule or fear. He carried a quiet authority that demanded respect. "Why are you helping me?" Mary Beth finally asked, her voice small but steady. The baskets in her hands felt heavier suddenly, as if the weight of her doubts had returned. "Because no one should be defined by the cruelty of others," he replied simply. His gaze softened, and Mary Beth felt a strange warmth spread through her, a sensation that had been foreign for years. "Your heart, your courage, that is what matters, not their laughter." A sudden breeze carried the scent of sagebrush and dry earth across the square, mingling with the aroma of fresh bread and hay. The world seemed to shift slightly, the sun casting long shadows behind the stalls and townsfolk, highlighting the contrast between the life Mary Beth had endured and the new possibilities standing before her. She lowered her baskets to the ground, feeling a little more grounded herself. I've never had anyone say that to me before," she admitted, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her otherwise firm demeanor. Tayanita's lips curved in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Then perhaps it is time someone did," he said. His eyes, dark and unwavering, seemed to peer into her very soul, and Mary Beth felt both exposed and strangely comforted. The past ridicule, the decades of whispers and pointed fingers, began to feel smaller in comparison to the quiet strength emanating from him. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, the shouts of children, the gossiping townsfolk, even the creak of wooden carts replaced by the subtle harmony of wind through the dusty square and the rhythmic beat of Tayanita's presence. Mary Beth realized that she had never truly felt seen until now, never understood that someone could value her not despite her size, but because of the spirit that carried her through years of hardship. He extended a hand toward her, simple, yet commanding in its promise of trust and protection. Mary Beth hesitated, a wave of doubt rising. Yet when she looked into his eyes, all the fear and shame that had burdened her for years seemed to dissolve. Slowly, she reached out, placing her hand in his. The connection, though brief and wordless, felt like the beginning of something larger, a bond forged not by appearances, but by courage, acceptance, and a shared sense of strength. The townsfolk continued to murmur, their astonishment palpable, but Mary Beth no longer heard them. For the first time in her life, she felt an ember of hope ignite inside her, a hope that she might be more than the cruel nicknames, more than the mockery, more than the big body they all sneered at. Standing beside Tayanita, she felt the faint, thrilling promise of change, of acceptance, and perhaps one day, even love. The days that followed changed Mary Beth Carrington's life in ways she had never imagined. Tayanita did not disappear after their encounter in the market. Instead, he remained nearby, a quiet presence that both unsettled and comforted her. At first, she worried about what the townsfolk would say, their eyes forever watching, ready to mock any hint of friendship or familiarity. But Tayanita paid them no mind. He seemed to walk in a world apart from their judgment, guided by a code of respect and strength that fascinated her. One afternoon, he appeared at her small homestead as she struggled to repair the roof of her barn, a task she had avoided for weeks because the ladder wobbled and her arms ached under the weight of the timber. Tayanita's approach was silent, almost reverent, as if he did not want to startle her. "May I help?" he asked, his deep voice steady and calm. Mary Beth glanced at him, the sun warming his bronze skin, beads glinting on his chest and arms, hair catching the light. I suppose you could," she said reluctantly, unsure why her voice trembled. He moved with practiced strength, lifting heavy beams with ease while Mary Beth guided them into place. The sweat on her brow mingled with the dust in the air, but she noticed only his focused expression, the way his muscles flexed with each movement, and the quiet patience in his actions. For hours they worked together in the heat, the rhythmic creak of wood and the occasional call of a distant bird their only soundtrack. With every nail driven and board secured, Mary Beth felt her confidence grow, not because of what she could do alone, but because she could share the task with someone who saw her as capable and worthy. When they finally stepped back to survey their work, Tayanita's dark eyes met hers. "You have strength that belies their whispers," he said. "Not in body alone, but in heart and spirit. That is what matters." Mary Beth's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time, someone had acknowledged her, not for her size, but for her resilience, her courage, her determination. Over the following days, Tayanita became a constant presence. He guided her through the ranch, teaching her how to read the weather by the wind and the sky, how to handle the livestock with care and authority, and how to move quietly through the hills when the coyotes came too close to the corral. Each lesson carried more than knowledge. Each moment carried trust, respect, and a subtle, growing intimacy. Mary Beth felt herself opening, the walls she had built around her heart slowly crumbling under the warmth of his acceptance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, Tayanita and Mary Beth sat atop the barn roof, sharing silence more meaningful than any conversation. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, fresh hay, and distant rain, mingling with the faint aroma of the earth itself. For once, Mary Beth allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel unburdened by the whispers of Willow Creek, unshackled from decades of shame. "Do they understand?" she asked quietly, watching a hawk circle high above the plains. Tayanita shook his head, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They never will. Some minds are too small to see what is right in front of them. That is their blindness, not your shame." His hand brushed hers briefly, a subtle gesture of connection that sent warmth racing through her veins. The night air grew cooler, and Mary Beth felt a thrill of safety she had never known, with Tayanita nearby, guiding, protecting, and valuing her. She could imagine a future she had once thought impossible, a life in which she was not mocked, not hidden, not shamed. She was a woman of strength and courage, capable of more than the town could understand. And with Tyanita's presence, she began to believe that she could finally be seen for who she truly was. As the stars blinked into existence above the endless plains, Mary Beth rested her head lightly against his shoulder, a gesture that spoke of trust, hope, and the quiet beginnings of love. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow where her heart might finally belong to someone who cherished her, not despite her body, but because of the strength, kindness, and fire that lived within it. Word of Mary Beth Carrington's growing connection with Tyanita spread through Willow Creek faster than wildfire. By mid-morning, whispers had become hushed murmurs, and hushed murmurs had become outright gossip. The townsfolk, fueled by curiosity and a sense of propriety warped by prejudice, began to question aloud why a woman they had long ridiculed could draw the attention of a man so striking and commanding. Mary Beth, carrying water to her small garden, could feel the weight of their stares. Children trailed behind her, pointing and whispering, while grown men lingered near the general store, their expressions a mixture of shock and skepticism. She adjusted the sleeves of her brown dress and gritted her teeth, determined to ignore their judgment. But even as she focused on her chores, a part of her could not help wondering how the town would react when Tyanita made his presence more obvious. It was just past noon when the challenge came. A group of men ranchers, storekeepers, and a few of the town council surrounded Mary Beth near the square, arms crossed and boots dug into the dusty ground. Their voices were sharp, carrying accusations and disbelief. "Why is he here with her?" demanded one of the taller men, his face flushed with indignation. "Does he not know what kind of woman she is?" She's not like the rest of us," another muttered nervously. Glancing at the warrior, Mary Beth's heart pounded, but she did not retreat. She stood taller, adjusting the baskets in her hands. "I am who I am," she said firmly, "and Tyanita does not see me the way you do. He sees my heart, my courage, and my strength. If that offends you, it is your blindness, not my shame." The townsfolk murmured amongst themselves, some clearly uncomfortable, others scoffing. It was then that Tyanita stepped forward, dust rising around his boots, sunlight glinting off his beaded necklaces and leather armbands. His long black hair framed a face that was calm but commanding. He did not raise his voice, but the weight of his presence silenced most of the crowd. "You question me for accepting her?" he said, his dark eyes scanning the group. "Do you not see your own pettiness reflected in these accusations? She is a woman of strength, courage, and heart. It is not her body you should concern yourselves with, but your own inability to understand what is honorable." Some of the men bristled, stepping closer, but Mary Beth felt an unexpected surge of pride. For the first time, she did not feel small. The same man who had once quietly accepted her at the saloon now stood before the town as her protector, his presence a shield against the ridicule that had haunted her for decades. One older woman, known for her sharp tongue and pointed gossip, spat into the dirt. "You think we'll accept this?" A warrior from the plains, here with her? Tyanita's gaze did not waver. "Acceptance is not yours to grant," he said simply. "It is mine to offer and hers to receive. Nothing else matters." A tense silence fell over the square, broken only by the creaking of a wooden cart in the distance and the occasional whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Mary Beth felt her pulse slow, a sense of relief mingling with triumph. Though the town might never understand, she had found someone who did, and that was enough. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square, Tyanita placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The simple gesture carried strength, protection, and reassurance. "They will talk," he said quietly, "but you must not let them dictate your worth. That belongs to you alone." Mary Beth met his eyes and felt a wave of gratitude and hope. For decades, she had endured whispers, laughter, and pointed fingers. Now, with Tyanita by her side, she realized that her life could belong to her in ways the town had never allowed. Standing there, facing the judgmental crowd, she felt courage she had never known. She was no longer just the woman they mocked. She was Mary Beth Carrington, strong, proud, and worthy of love and respect. The town might resist, but she knew one thing with certainty. With Tyanita beside her, she was no longer alone. And no amount of ridicule could take that away. The morning sun had barely climbed above the jagged horizon when Willow Creek's Main Street erupted into chaos. Word of Mary Beth Carrington and Tyanita's defiance had reached every corner of the town. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered, the rough wooden boards of the street echoing with stomping boots, whispered accusations, and the occasional shout. Mary Beth stood at the center, baskets forgotten at her feet. Her brown dress, dusty from days of work, clung slightly to her arms, evidence of the strength she had carried through decades of ridicule. Beside her, Tyanita remained calm, shirtless, and imposing, his muscular frame glinting with beads of sunlight. Long black hair framed his face, and tribal jewelry, beaded necklaces, armbands, leather accents caught the light with each subtle movement. The warrior's presence radiated authority and quiet power, a shield against the tide of judgment threatening to overwhelm her. A town elder, his face lined with years and skepticism, stepped forward. "We've endured your nonsense long enough," he shouted, voice cracking with indignation. This union cannot happen. She is not one of us." Mary Beth's chest tightened, but she did not falter. For the first time in her life, she felt the courage to speak freely. "I am not ashamed of who I am," she said, voice strong and steady, carrying across the street like a bell. "And neither is he. You may laugh, whisper, or point fingers, but you will not dictate my life. You will not dictate my worth." The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered in confusion, others grumbled with irritation. A few of the younger men, emboldened by centuries of ingrained prejudice, stepped forward, hands brushing the hilts of their pistols. "You think this man will stay in our town?" one asked. A stranger, a warrior, with her? Tyanita's dark eyes swept the group, calm but piercing. "I am no stranger to respect and honor," he said slowly, his voice carrying an almost tangible weight. "She is a woman of courage, heart, and strength. If you cannot see that, it is your own blindness that speaks, not hers." A gust of wind swept through the square, lifting dust and straw, and the townsfolk instinctively stepped back. The air carried the earthy scent of sagebrush and dry dirt, mingling with the faint aroma of hay and leather. Tyanita's presence was a force of nature, and for the first time, many in the crowd realized that their mockery held no power over this pair. One woman, notorious for her sharp tongue, spat to the side. "You think he'll stay? He belongs to the plains, not our town. And her, she's not like us." Tyanita did not move, but his gaze, steady and unwavering, met hers. "Acceptance is not yours to grant," he said quietly, yet every word struck like thunder. "It is ours to claim. Nothing else matters." Mary Beth felt a rush of warmth and strength as the crowd murmured, unsettled by the truth in his words. The wind tugged at her hair, the sun highlighted the dust on her dress, and in that moment, she understood that she was no longer just the woman the town mocked. She was Mary Beth Carrington, strong, proud, and unafraid. A young boy, no older than 10, whispered to his friend, "Do you think maybe she's brave?" The words, innocent yet potent, carried across the street, a subtle acknowledgement that change might be possible. Even in the smallest hearts. Tyanita placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, a protective yet tender gesture. "They will talk," he said softly, "but you must not let their opinions define your worth. That belongs to you alone." Mary Beth's lips curved into a small smile, the first in years unshadowed by shame. With Tianita by her side, she felt the courage to stand taller than ever before. The townsfolk might resist, whisper, or scoff, but their power to belittle her had ended the moment he chose to stand beside her. Together, they were a force neither mockery nor prejudice could break Dot as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows. Across the square, Mary Beth and Tianita stood united. Their bond, forged in respect, courage, and quiet defiance, had begun to shift the winds of Willow Creek. And though the town's judgment still lingered, it was powerless against the strength of a woman finally seen and the warrior who refused to let her be hidden any longer. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting the town in warm golden light that seemed to soften the harsh edges of the dusty streets. Mary Beth Carrington stood outside her small home, the heavy baskets of chores set aside for the moment. Around her, the town's whispers had quieted. The sharp jeers of ridicule had grown faint, replaced by uncertain glances and hesitant acknowledgement. The tide of mockery that had defined her life was ebbing, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, savoring the possibility of peace. Beside her, Tianita remained calm, his muscular frame silhouetted against the warm sunlight, long black hair catching glints of amber and gold. Beaded necklaces, leather armbands, and tribal accents adorned his broad chest and arms, shimmering subtly as he shifted his stance. His dark eyes, steady and unwavering, remained fixed on her, radiating both protection and pride. "You've changed the way they see you," he said quietly, his voice low but carrying an authority that seemed to settle even the restless town. Mary Beth shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "No, I haven't changed. I've always been the same. It's just someone finally sees me for who I am." Her fingers brushed against his, a subtle gesture of trust and connection, a bridge between the woman who had endured decades of mockery and the man who had recognized her worth from the beginning. The townsfolk, lingering at the edges of the street, watched with mixed expressions. Some shifted uncomfortably under Tianita's unwavering gaze. Others seemed moved, perhaps recognizing the truth that had long escaped them. Mary Beth was strong, capable, and worthy of respect, not because she had changed, but because she had always possessed these qualities. An older woman, once notorious for her sharp tongue and pointed gossip, stepped forward. "Mary Beth, I see now that we were wrong," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "You are more than we understood." Mary Beth's heart softened, but she did not let their words sway her entirely. She had lived decades under the shadow of mockery and ridicule. This acknowledgement, though welcome, was secondary to the validation she had already received from Tianita. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Your understanding comes late, but it matters nonetheless." Tianita placed a protective hand lightly on her shoulder, and the townsfolk instinctively stepped back, respect tempered with awe in their expressions. "They will come around," he said, glancing at her. "Some will take longer than others, but strength and truth have a way of lasting, and you, Mary Beth, have proven both." Mary Beth looked out across the town, the dusty streets, wooden buildings and shuttered windows softened by the glow of evening light. She felt a thrill of hope she had never dared to imagine decades ago. For years she had been ridiculed as big body, laughed at, whispered about, and scorned. Yet here she stood proud, unashamed, and no longer alone. The woman who had endured so much had been seen, accepted, and valued. Mary Beth began, her voice catching slightly. She searched for words, realizing that no single phrase could capture the depth of her gratitude, courage, or hope. Finally, she met Tyanita's eyes, dark and steady, and simply said, "Thank you for everything." He inclined his head, his lips curving into a subtle, reassuring smile. "No thanks are necessary. Your courage is your own. I only chose to see it as I always should have." The two of them stood together in the golden light, a quiet testament to strength, acceptance, and resilience. Around them, the town shifted, whispers fading into silence, some nodding, some averting their eyes, but all recognizing a new reality. Mary Beth Carrington was no longer defined by their mockery, and Tyanita would not allow her to be diminished. As evening settled over Willow Creek, the wind carried the scent of sagebrush, dry earth, and distant rain. The quiet rustle of leaves, the faint clip-clop of a distant horse, and the soft glow of twilight painted a new beginning. Mary Beth rested, her head lightly against Tyanita's shoulder, a gesture of trust, love, and hope. And for the first time in her life, she believed in tomorrow, a tomorrow filled not with ridicule, but with respect, companionship, and the promise of a future built on courage and heart. Together, they turned toward the small homestead, the town's murmurs fading behind them, and walked into the sunset, unafraid, unashamed, and ready to embrace a life of acceptance, love, and strength that had been waiting for them all along.